And of course, the issue of stopping Iran's pursuit of a nuclear weapon has been an issue of concern to the Jewish community for several decades now. And now we're at a crossroads. With the Iran deal on the table, it's provoked very, very strong feelings in our community. So we wanted to do something. We wanted to have a conversation. We felt it was important that our community come away educated, informed, and activated about the issue. So to that end, we put together a panel of experts, academicians, experts on the issue of Iran, non-political, and we have the entire spectrum of opinions represented here. So I hope that you're going to have a good view into everything from those who feel that the deal is a great deal and is going to make the world a more peaceful place to those who think it's a terrible deal and will make the world a more dangerous place. Now, for the JCC to be able to bring you these sorts of programs, we rely upon your generosity. This is an organization that does rely upon the donations of individuals. This event is free tonight, and in large part, it was made possible by the generosity, the underwriting of the JCRC and the Levav family. So thank you for helping make tonight possible. And if you're inspired by tonight's event, if you enjoyed tonight's event, we encourage you to also consider making a contribution. We have several ways you can make a contribution tonight. We're doing something very high-tech, which is, we're Silicon Valley, so we should be trying. You can text a donation to the JCC. There you go. There's the number. You can text your pledge to that number up on the screen. If you don't get the whole texting thing, you can also drop some money in the tzedakah box outside. We have pledge cards outside, but anything you could do to help defray the costs of events like this will enable us to continue to bring you free or for very, very little cost events like this. So, before I turn it over to our moderator, Michael Krasny, I want to lay out a couple of ground rules for this evening. It's an emotional topic, and this is a topic that has gotten people riled up. So I want to ask that everyone be respectful of all the opinions that are voiced tonight. I just had the opportunity to spend some time backstage with these gentlemen who are sitting discussing this issue intensely and very, very amicably amongst each other. So I want to ask you to be respectful to all the opinions that are voiced here tonight. These are guests in our home, and we want to treat them that way. So we're going to be taking your questions on the cards that you got when you came in. So please take a moment during the panel, anytime, to write down your thoughts, write down your questions. If you didn't get one of these cards, people will be coming around and passing them out, and they'll also be coming around to collect them. So, with that, if you still don't feel like your opinion has been heard and you haven't gotten it out tonight, we are live tweeting this event. So feel free to live tweet at hashtag OFJCC Iran deal. And with that, I want to thank you all for being here tonight. Thank you for your generosity in supporting the JCC, and it is my great pleasure to turn the mic over to someone you all know well. You know his voice. You hear it every day at KQED's forum, our NPR best friend, Michael Krasny.
Thank you, Zach, and thank you all. Am I on here? I'm not hearing my booming broadcaster voice. Okay, that's better. Thank you. And thank you all for being here. This is, I know, very important to many of you. And in fact, I just have a sense, I'm not doing a poll here or anything, but I believe, and I won't do this, however, if I said how many of you are in favor of this deal, about half the people in the room would raise their hands. And I said how many of you are opposed to it, probably about half the people. This has divided the Jewish community. This has divided America. And I hope that we can, with four rather distinguished and certainly enlightened academics, which is not always the case, by the way, that we can inform you and bring light to you in the course of this evening. Let me tell you who is here, and I think you're very fortunate to have these four gentlemen with us this morning. Did you see what happens when you broadcast in the morning and you do things in the evening? On my immediate left, which has nothing to do with political bias or anything of that sort, is Abe Sofair, who is the first George P. Schultz Distinguished Scholar and Senior Fellow at Hoover, at the Hoover Institution. His work is focused on power over war within the U.S. government and on issues related to international law, terrorism, diplomacy, and national security. And appropriate for this evening, his most recent book is Taking on Iran, Strength, Diplomacy, and the Iranian Threat. Please welcome Abe Sofair. We also have David Holloway with us here. He's Raymond Sprucent's Professor of International History and Professor of Political Science as well at Stanford, Senior Fellow at the Stanford Institute, For international studies, his research focuses on the international history of nuclear weapons. Again, most appropriate person to have with us on stage. Also on science and technology in the Soviet Union, the relationship between international history and international relations theory. He's the author of Stalin and the Bomb, the Soviet Union and the Atomic Energy, 1939 to 1956, as well as the Soviet Union and the arms race. Please welcome David Holloway. And Alfoneh is with us, and it's certainly a credit to the people here at the JCC that they flew him in from Washington special for this evening. He is a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies and a top expert on Iran. He was with the American Enterprise Institute for a number of years, specializes in civil military relations in Iran and the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, and is the author of Iran Unveiled, How the Revolutionary Guards is Transforming Iran from Theocracy into Military Dictatorship. Please welcome Alfoneh. And immediately next to me is Abbas Milani, Director of Iranian Studies at Stanford University and professor by courtesy in the Division Stanford Global Studies. Been one of the founding co-directors of the Iran Democracy Project, research fellow at the Hoover Institution, and the author of a splendid book which we featured on my program, which is a biography of Shah. Please welcome Abbas Milani. So glad to have all of you gentlemen here, and nobody here necessarily has the emes. I use a good Yiddish word for those of you who, like me, are fanciers of the Yiddish language about what's around the corner in terms of geopolitics or what we can expect, but we have people certainly representing very different points of view. And I thought, David Holloway, not to put you on the spot here, but you are perhaps of these four the voice more in favor of the treaty, such as it is. Now, let me be careful how I frame this question to you because I don't want to put you on the defensive here. But there are many who fear that this treaty will be a sure pathway to the destruction of the state of Israel. I mean, and here we are in the Jewish Community Center, and I know that to be the case. So from your perspective, what can you ensure people, or can you ensure people, that this will make the world a safer place, that in some fashion this ought to be a trusted treaty for greater diplomacy and better relations between the West and specifically the United States and Iran, but also the safety of the state of Israel?
Zach, when can you hear me? Zach, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Zach, when he introduced us, said some people think this is a great agreement and others think it's a terrible agreement. I don't think it's a great agreement, but I am inclined to think that we should go forward and approve it and apply it in a rigorous way. And to answer your question, yes, for over 20 years, the prospect of an Iranian nuclear program and an Iranian nuclear bomb has been deeply worrying. And of course it has been especially worrying for Israel, since it is a program organized by a state that not only doesn't recognize the right of Israel to exist, but uses quite inflammatory language about the destruction of Israel, about wiping Israel off the map. So this is an issue of absolutely fundamental importance for Israel. I think nobody would question that. I think it's also fundamentally important more broadly for the Middle East and indeed for world politics. The way I think about it is this, that if you think over the last 20 years, Iran has put together a nuclear program. It has certainly, at least in the early years, certainly did work on weapons, but it has said publicly and still insists that the goal is a peaceful nuclear program. The anxieties have grown over time because Iran has made progress, in particular with its program for enriching uranium. There are two paths to the bomb. I mean, the most difficult thing to build a bomb is to get the material, the fissile material, either highly enriched uranium or plutonium. And Iran has been pursuing and expanding a program to enrich uranium to the point where best Western estimates are that it is now within 2 or 3 months of accumulating enough fissile material for one bomb. And so the issue is that this process has continued with Iran acquiring and moving closer and closer to acquiring the fissile material you need for a bomb. What I think this particular agreement does, to be brief, is not to resolve this issue, not to resolve political issues in the Middle East, but to provide a kind of breathing space, if it's implemented, a breathing space of maybe 10 years, 10 to 15 years, which would open up the possibility in a Middle East that's changing of trying to find some way out of the political situation in the Middle East, always bearing in mind, of course, the survival, not only the survival, but the well-being of Israel.
But you're also including the arms race that would develop with Egypt and Saudi Arabia and others who would want nuclear weapons. This is just a temporary way station, though. I mean, I think that's what I'm hearing you say. Well, 10 years, 15 years at the most.
I'm saying it opens
at the best.
a breathing space, if it's implemented, and I think there are reasons to think that the most important elements can be monitored and verified. Absolutely, you cannot say, oh, we've had this agreement, let's relax. On the contrary, we have this agreement, and it's time limited. Something has to be done.
Let me go to Ali on this, who is in opposition to this treaty. I mean, do you see this, as David says, as maybe just a stopgap, or is it likely that, again, Iran can't be trusted? They've been known to cheat on these kinds of things in the past. That's their track record. And also, they have said very stridently that they want to annihilate and destroy Israel, and they're going to get billions of dollars to help them, not only with Hezbollah and Hamas and so forth, but, and yet at the same time, what David's saying weighs as sensible in a lot of people's minds, because let's just have a breather here. Let's just allow things to take a better course.
With your permission, since I'm an Iranian, I have to start my little answer with an Iranian joke, which is about an Iranian mom who wants her daughter. So the joke is about an Iranian mom who wants her daughter to marry a suitable young Iranian gentleman. You know, the young couple, they have a conversation, after which, the girl comes to mom and says, Mom, this person, he's an atheist. He does not believe in heaven. He does not believe in hell. I cannot marry him. And the mom says, darling, you marry him, and the two of us will convince him that hell truly exists. Now, to President Obama's credit, I have to say, they made Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei understand that hell truly exists. And hell is a place where there are many, many American and international sanctions against Iran. Iran was on the verge of bankruptcy. Very, very good thing from US perspective, if you want to engage in nuclear negotiations. But from the moment that the Islamic Republic representatives came to meet their American counterparts, everything changed. Instead of debilitating the regime's ability to maintain and continue a nuclear program which could develop a bomb sometime in the future, the US government, unfortunately, had too little ambitions. They, exactly as the honorable member of the panel also commented, wanted to postpone the crisis. They did not want to solve the crisis. And therefore, unfortunately, this agreement allows the regime to preserve an industrial-scale nuclear program, maintain it, and develop it further in the future, in the course of the next 8, 10 to 15 years. Everyone here may believe that 15 years from now, the Middle East may be a calmer place. And the US has greater opportunities to force Iran to abandon its nuclear ambitions. In Tehran, they believe and they are working towards a Middle East which is not calmer than today, and in which the US will have a lesser degree of influence. Therefore, I unfortunately believe that this is a bad deal.
Forgive me, Ali, we do have something in common with Iran. I mean, the argument in favor of this deal is maybe it will open up diplomacy. As David said, maybe it'll give us a stopgap measure. Maybe we can monitor and do it without their cheating. That may be even implausible, where maybe most people are concerned. But we have a common enemy, ISIS. And that's a reality in this whole deal behind the scenes, I think. Iran is afraid of ISIS, as they well should be. We are afraid of ISIS. We know that ISIS is a terrible, formidable enemy. The only ones that are fighting them right now are the Kurds and maybe the Iranians on the side or underneath through something you're an expert on, the Revolutionary Guard. So there is something that would possibly bring us together, the argument would go.
May I challenge? I'm a guest. I have to behave well, you know.
Well, I'm the devil's advocate, that's okay.
May I challenge that assumption? Who says that ISIS and emergence of ISIS is actually bad from Tehran's point of view? I totally disagree. The emergence of Islamic State has made Iraqi Shias totally dependent on support from Tehran. Shia Iraqis are first and foremost Iraqi nationalists. They want to be independent from Tehran. But the emergence of a formidable enemy like the Islamic State forces them to seek support in Tehran so that they become more or less a protectorate of the Islamic Republic of Iran. At the same time, preservation of a degree of Islamic State presence in the Middle East region makes the US believes that there actually is a shared enemy, a common enemy against which they can fight. And that, of course, also helps and benefits the rulers of the Islamic Republic of Iran. So what they are doing is in reality to contribute to a permanent state of crisis in the Middle East region, waging a war of attrition against US public opinion, so you, ladies and gentlemen, 10 to 15 years from now, would not want to engage militarily in the Middle East region. Under those conditions, the Islamic Republic could continue and reactivate the nuclear program, which unfortunately is now being sanctioned by this deal.
Thank you. Let me pass the mic to you, Abe. From your perspective, and Abe is opposed to the treaty also.
It's not a treaty.
Well, okay,
it's
you're
not.
opposed to the deal, I'm sorry. It is not a treaty, thank
The
you.
political arrangement is what the president called it, yeah.
Well, let's talk, though, about the sanctions that could have maybe had more efficacy if they had been kept in place, because the notion was that it was like a house of cards. Once the United States made this deal or this political arrangement or whatever you want to call it, the others would pull out and they would not be able to go back and keep the sanctions up the way they had been. That's at least what the smart money is saying about this.
Well, I think you got me here. You can hear me. It's kind of boring compared to attacking the overall deal, which is really a terrible deal in my view, because it does sanction the Iranian nuclear program. It's going to lead to much more nuclear weapons type preparation around the whole Middle East. It's going to put a lot of pressure on Israel to act, actually, over time. And it doesn't deal with Iran's interventions in the other Middle Eastern countries. It doesn't deal with the fact that Iran is violating human rights within Iran. And we had an analogy for this when we dealt with the Soviet Union. We dealt with all the issues, and we were proud to be dealing with all the issues. I'm astonished that the administration is sort of trumpets the fact we only deal with the nuclear issue as though that's some kind of a benefit to us, that we're only dealing with the one issue that we might be embarrassed about because they may actually go forward despite our threats that we're going to do something about it, and we're not going to do anything about it. And not wanting that event to arise, we make this deal in order to get this kind of temporary relief that my friend David has talked about, which is, that's all there is in this deal. But I do want to say, in response to Michael Krasny's very pointed question, this deal is done. You need to understand that the UN resolution adopted immediately after the deal was signed provides for the termination of 6 important UN resolutions if Iran satisfies the IAEA that it has complied with Annex 5 of the so-called JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive, not at all comprehensive, Plan of Action. It's the opposite of comprehensive. But the fact is that the issue before Congress is not the deal. If Iran complies, as it will, regardless of what the U.S. does, and they've said so publicly, and I'm sure they would, because they get so much from this deal, about $100 billion in addition to massive sanctions relief. The only issue before Congress will be whether this JCPOA is going to become a law of the United States. That is, whether we're going to give up all the U.S. sanctions that are listed in the JCPOA, in addition to all the sanctions that are going to go away when the UN resolutions are terminated, to use the word in the resolution, terminated. Now, I think it's a catastrophe that we are terminating all those UN resolutions, irrespective of the fact that they don't just deal with the nuclear program of Iran. They deal with Iran's support for terrorism. They deal with the ballistic missile program. They deal with the massive armament issues that Europeans and Chinese and Russians have been wanting to supply to Iran, but we managed to convince them not to do that, to agree to these limitations. And they even mention Iran's support for terrorism through groups like Hezbollah. So those sanctions are not just nuclear sanctions. They are sanctions that relate to all those activities in which a radical regime is engaging. So the only things left after this are the U.S. sanctions. The Europeans have announced they're going to withdraw all their sanctions against Iran. So the issue is, do you want to give up all the sanctions against Iran? Everything. Even though you're saying that, oh, this is just a nuclear deal, we're going to keep the pressure on in all these other areas. It's just not credible. The president is using words like he's saying, if we keep the sanctions, the U.S. sanctions on Iran, it's going to kill the deal. But the deal is done. The basic benefits that we could get from this deal that David mentions are going to be adopted if Iran complies. Of course, if Iran doesn't comply, it doesn't matter what happens with the JCPOA. But the fact is that people should calm down and understand that we're not talking about affecting the basics of that deal. What we're talking about is whether we're going to give up all the U.S. sanctions listed in the JCPOA, and whether, in addition to that, the JCPOA has these annexes where we commit to help Iran, not just us, of course, China and Russia and all the others, to help Iran with their nuclear program in many, many ways. We're going to help them not just with safety, we're going to help them do all sorts of things to basically make them highly proficient in the nuclear area. And not only that, we're going to pay for it. This is sort of like North Korea, and you know the chief negotiator for the United States is the negotiator for the North Korea deal, and that's the kind of thing she did there. We're going to give you a light water reactor. Do the same thing. We're going to give you the most advanced light water reactor. And when you hear about the heavy water reactor that Iran has agreed to modify, well, the modification plan is something we're going to work on with them. We're going to pay for, they're going to pay for over 50%. But that clearly implies that the rest of the world is going to pay.
Abe, let me interrupt you because...
so that is the issue. The issue is...
The deal is done, as you say.
Right.
A little levity here. When President Trump comes on board, it'll all change, of course. But,
well, that's one of the ironies.
Let me get us back to the deal itself, because as you can tell, there's some really nuanced views here, and Abbas Milani has said publicly that this is the best, worst deal that we could get, and I want to hear him codify that. Before I do, though, since I know, there are many people who are concerned about the fate of Israel, we were talking before about Hussein Sheikh Alawi, who is a foreign affairs advisor high up, and who said today, and this was in the Israeli Times, who said Israel must be annihilated. We are not in any way backpedaling on that. The Supreme Commander himself, or the Supreme Leader, Ali Khomeini, has said on many occasions, Israel must be annihilated. I mean, Jewish people get very nervous when they hear that kind of talk, understandably so. And really, how serious are we to take this rhetoric, particularly with a nuclear-armed Iran?
Well, first of all, I think Jewish people, I think they can hear, should get nervous. It is absolutely unconscionable for another state to threaten the destruction of another state. But if I was an Israeli, I wouldn't lose much sleep over these threats, because Israel has the capacity to defend itself, as the heads of Mossad have repeatedly said, as the heads of Israel's military have repeatedly said. The idea that one bomb from Iran can destroy the state of Israel is, in my view, undervaluing what Israel has done militarily, as undervaluing what Israel is capable of, is overlooking the fact that Israel has submarines with nuclear warheads right off the waters of Iran. So while it is
Israel, has Dimona. I mean, very strong nuclear arms.
It has strong nuclear arms. It doesn't admit to it, but it is estimated that they have 200 bombs. I certainly understand if I was sitting in Israel, that I would be worried about these unconscionable threats that are made. But are those threats enough to now say we have to scuttle this deal? Is that the wise and prudent policy in this moment? I say it's the least bad deal possible because, first of all, depending on who you're listening to, you get a very different definition of this deal. When the deal was first announced, I listened to Obama and I listened to Rouhani give an explanation of the deal. They were talking about two different deals. Really, Obama said, we have completely blocked their path to a nuclear bomb. We have made serious fundamental concessions. Rouhani said, this is one of the greatest victories for Iran. We haven't made a single concession. We forced them to accept all of our demands. They're both misrepresenting the fact, in my view. This doesn't block every pathway to a bomb, but neither does the status quo. In fact, in the next 15 years, Iran will have about half of the centrifuges it now is working. And it will have 1/4 of the centrifuges it has ready to go. Iran has about 19,000 centrifuges. This allows 5,600 of them. Iran has 10,000 kilos of low-enriched uranium. Everything except 330 kilos will be shipped out. Will Iran possibly cheat? Absolutely. Is this a very reliable regime? Absolutely not. If you believe this is a reliable regime, I have a bridge I can sell you right around the corner. That's why it is the least bad deal. Why is it the least bad deal? I completely disagree with what Mr. Alfoneh said about ISIS. ISIS is a serious threat for Iran. ISIS is a serious threat for Iran's ally in Iraq. ISIS is a serious threat for everyone. And ISIS is a serious threat for Europe and the United States. Have no doubt about it. If these 3 brave United States soldiers had not stopped, there will now possibly be 200, 300 innocent people killed on that train. ISIS is coming home to roost. Those who created ISIS are going to pay a very heavy price. And Iran knows this. Killing Iranian Shiites is one of the highest goals for ISIS. Furthermore, I completely disagree with the notion that there is one Iran, that this one Iran wants to destabilize the Middle East for the United States. Khamenei wants it, absolutely. Many in the IRGC want it, absolutely. The Quds Brigade wants it, absolutely. But Iran is not the Quds Brigade. Iran is not Khamenei. Khamenei literally had about 8 million votes out of 40 million votes last time. Khamenei's representative had 8 million votes. The notion that Khamenei is a monolith, that he controls everything, that he pulls all the strings, is a figment of imagination. The IRGC itself is a split. Iranian society is profoundly split. Right now, as we speak, we were talking in the back room, Rafsanjani and Khamenei, two 50-year-old friends, are at each other's throats. They are publicly attacking one another in ways that is unimaginable in the past.
It's vying for power. It's constantly tug of war, even with Rouhani.
I completely believe that Iran is in a fluid state. There is the IRGC, much of the IRGC, connected to many of the conservative clerics, led by Khamenei, but there are about 8 million votes, literally. Now, it's a very militant million. It is organized, it is mobilized, it is brutal. It can do to a country what it has done to Syria. People of Iran know this. That's why they don't confront them publicly. But there is another middle group led by Rouhani, led by Rafsanjani, led by many of the reformists who don't want the status quo. When 3 million people came to the streets of Tehran, one of their slogans was, neither Gaza nor Lebanon, long live Iran. That is a different Iran than the Iran that he describes. That is part of Iran. The Iran that he describes is also part of Iran. A deal, in my view, if it prolongs this process for 10 years, will allow the possibility, there's no guarantee, but the possibility, in my view, exists that these forces that I am referring to, the 18 million people who voted for Rouhani, Rafsanjani, Rouhani, Khatami, many in the IRGC, who want a different Iran, who want the public domain cleansed of the thugs who dominate it, who want the market cleansed of the IRGC who dominates it, that Iran might gain ascendancy. And the only way long-term peace for Israel can be guaranteed is if we have a democratic Iran, a democratic Turkey, and a democratic Egypt. ISIS threatens all of these.
Let me take that up, Abbas, and go to any of the other participants, because one could be very skeptical about the possibility. It was the neocons who thought that there would be democracy throughout the Middle East. Now we have Sisi in Egypt, Mubarak revisited, I think it's safe to say. We have more turmoil in Syria than we had ever imagined possible. We have turmoil in Yemen. I mean, Middle East is a constant powder keg, and democracy is not exactly making pathways. So one has to ask, to what extent is that possible? And to what extent is it possible, particularly given the failure of the Green Revolution in Iran, for Iran to move toward democracy? I mean, I'll throw that out to any of the members of the panel here. Are we talking about maybe a bit of a pipe dream here in terms of the likelihood? I mean, I know Iran is a very dominated by youth country, and that's a positive. And, they have the internet, and they have all of these things that they're exposed to. And there is really a lot of sympathy. Iranians, probably more than any country in the Middle East, Iranian citizens like Americans. I don't know how much that bears weight, but it's actually the truth. I mean, more than any country you can think of in the Middle East or in the Persian Gulf region. But to what extent can Iran move, even with this stopgap measure, towards some kind of democracy, or even for that matter, toward better diplomacy between, again, Iran and the West? That, it seems to me, is the fundamental question that we're dealing with here. Ali?
If we look at the consequences of the type of deal that the US government and the Permanent 5+1 group have offered to Iran, Professor Milani and even the US government, they make the argument, advance the argument that this deal is going to make Iran slightly more liberal, slightly more open, and it's going to help people who negotiated the deal from the Iranian side, which means President Rouhani and the technocratic elites of Iran. I actually agree with Professor Milani when it comes to the factions within the system in Iran. As I see it, I see three fundamental power centers. One of them being the technocratic elites, represented by President Rouhani, who is by far the most competent and sophisticated president that Iran has had ever since the revolution of 1979. He represents a specific faction. So does former President Rafsanjani, who is in reality the man behind Rouhani. They represent the technocratic elites of Iran. On the other extreme, there is the Revolutionary Guards, which is against the nuclear deal because they believe that the deal is going to strengthen Rouhani, and also because they actually need the United States as a foreign enemy. And they certainly also are very, very concerned that this type of liberalization of the Iranian political system would lead to collapse of the regime, just like collapse of the Soviet Union. During the 1990s, when President Khatami was in power and he was trying to open up the political system, he was accused of being Ayatollah Gorbachev. Now, why Ayatollah Gorbachev? Because Gorbachev, he was a loyal member of the Communist Party. He was a pious believer in communism, but he started a political reform process which led to the total collapse of the system. Now, the Revolutionary Guards people, they say, Rouhani may or may not, some way down the road do the same thing. Make changes which make the system collapse. In the middle, we have Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei. And he is just like a pendulum. He is oscillating between the two power centers. He believes and he needs the group of technocrats because they managed to persuade him that the sanctions regime was ruining Iran's economy. Iran as a state was going to collapse completely under the weight of the sanctions regime. Mr. Khamenei understands that. But at the same time, Mr. Khamenei also needs the support of the Revolutionary Guards because it was the Revolutionary Guards which managed to suppress the Green Revolution of 2009. Without the brutal intervention of the Revolutionary Guards, the system could not have survived. This is why you see Mr. Khamenei making contradictory statements also when it comes to the nuclear deal. One day he is supporting the line of his president, and the other day he's extending support, moral support and political support to the Revolutionary Guards. He's oscillating. Now, does this deal actually benefit the people the US wants to benefit from it, which means the technocratic elites? I am not so sure. If you take a look at the Iranian economy, the Revolutionary Guards is not only a military organization, it's also a business empire. As soon as money starts trickling into the Iranian system, as soon as money begins entering Tehran Stock Exchange, the Revolutionary Guards is going to be one of the main beneficiaries of easing of the sanctions regime. Let's not forget, in 2009, the Iranian government liberalized and privatized the Iran Telecom organization. Iran Telecom is the largest phone company in Iran. And privatization, everything in our country is upside down. Everywhere else in the world, privatization means transfer of ownership of an entity from the government sector to the private sector. In Iran, it means transfer of ownership from a relatively transparent part of the economy into the totally intransparent part of the government economy. The Revolutionary Guards they bid for the ownership of Iran Telecom, and they purchased it for $8 billion cash. Now, the annual military budget of the Revolutionary Guards, if you look at the Iran budget, it is only $5.9 billion. So these good members of the Revolutionary Guards have stolen so much money that they could own and purchase majority of the votes of the stocks of Iran Telecom. Now, tomorrow there are going to be European companies investing in companies in Iran because of the easing of the sanctions regime. Don't you think that the Revolutionary Guards is going to benefit from it on Tehran Stock Exchange? How would that benefit the Rouhani and the technocratic elites of the Islamic Republic of Iran? I don't see that happening.
Well, Ali, let me go to that because I think this is something that is of great concern to those like you who are opposed to this agreement. Let me go to David Holloway again on this. It's not only that Iran will get richer by this, but that Iran has been dedicated to terrorism and has been a republic, Islamic Republic, fomenting terrorism almost, well, not only in the Middle East, but one could argue there was a Jewish synagogue in Argentina, for example, that was blowing up, and I think that it goes back and is easily traceable back to Iran. So these things have been going on for years and continue to go on. Now it's going to have a stronger economy as a result of this treaty. But I keep coming back, on the other hand, to ISIS. two gentlemen on my right are in disagreement about this, but it seems to me that there could be common cause again between, you're the expert on international relations. Don't the United States and Iran both have, I use the old common language about this, a dog in that fight with ISIS?
Yes, I think, sorry. First of all, of course, Iran has been supporting terrorism and has great ambitions in the region and indeed that extend around the world. That the nature of the regime as it has been absolutely should not, as it were, vanish and talk about a deal on nuclear weapons.
It's also got strength, forgive me, but in Yemen now, it's got strength with the Houthis, it's got strength in Syria, and it's particularly has strength in Iraq.
Yes. Our war in Iraq removed the buffer state between Iran, between the Gulf and the Levant. Right. The war in Iraq also left the US with the sense that we don't want to put boots on the ground again in the Middle East. So we're in a period of really not being forward-leaning in this. The Middle East also looks more complicated because alongside the Shia fanaticism, we now have Sunni extremism of a really horrendous kind in ISIS. So where do you fit? Yes, Iran is fighting ISIS. Yes, absolutely. There's a more complicated picture, so there's something to talk about to Iran about ISIS. I don't think it's a kind of overriding interest that will override disagreements. But the Middle East is more complicated. I think it's not just an issue about whether Iran will become democratic or not. Just the balance of forces there is different. And Iran has benefited from, frankly, mistakes that we have made. And so the way I think about, okay, if we get a breathing space, and I think it's important not to forget how worried people have been about Iranian nuclear weapons. Somehow that's kind of dismissed. And if I can make a little detour to answer a point that Abe made, and he said, oh yes, the heavy water reactor, we're even going to help them pay to redesign it. That's so that basically we have a say in the design of this reactor. And this is a reactor people were extremely worried about. It was due to go online actually last year, before the interim agreement was signed in November 2013, and it would have been capable of producing plutonium for nuclear weapons. This was a real kind of something people who were worried about it really wanted to avoid. But to come back to the point about a kind of breathing space or a 10-year, 15-year kind of, as I would hope and actually think likely, removal of the possibility of an Iranian bomb, that it's not just whether Iran will change, it's whether the US can work out a strategy for the Middle East that takes account of these new factors, both about, not only about US unwillingness to put boots on the ground, but also some kind of uncertainty about the utility of military force in achieving political goals. This is a very complicated situation.
It's more complicated, I think, than it ever has been, and that's really saying something. But I wonder if I could go back to you, Abe. Are we talking here about just a division between, as Benjamin Netanyahu would have it, and others, war or diplomacy? Was that really the choice in coming to this place that we are now? Was either war or diplomacy?
I think the President Obama is talking that way too. And I don't agree with either one of them. I don't think the choice is between war and diplomacy. I think that Abbas Milani has the right objective. I'm not going to sleep well if I have to wait for democracies to come to all those countries before Israel has security. That's for sure. But his basic point is that Iran is very divided and that there's hope there. And I simply believe that a more certain path not certain path, but a more certain path to success in converting a radical regime like Iran is the path we followed with the Soviet Union, where we took them on, not militarily, not directly. I don't want a war with Iran. I don't want to attack Iran's nuclear facilities. But Iran is overstretched. They're overstretched in Syria, Yemen, Iraq. They're broke. The inflation's run wild. Ali's absolutely right about the economy is teetering. The public is very upset at this regime. And here we are giving them a lifeline. We are absolutely going to give them all this money back in the midst of this effort to basically convince the Iranian people that this regime is not good for them, that this regime is a failure. Instead, they're going to declare victory. They're going to get all this money. They're going to be able to easily continue what they're doing in Syria, which is massively inhumane, and everything else they're doing. And frankly, we can make common cause against ISIS, but it's the Kurds that have been fighting ISIS. And we have just now started to support the Kurds. Why aren't we supporting Turkey in Syria? Why aren't we supporting the Kurds more emphatically? Over 10% of the Iranian population is Kurdish. We should be supporting not only the Kurds of Iraq, but the Kurds of Iran. We should be making life uncomfortable for them. There's nothing wrong with that. They are an evil regime. They truly are like a gangster group, a criminal enterprise, and we're making a deal with them that they can go on with all their other criminal activity if they only stop one piece of their criminal activity. It's an amazing deal to me. I find it's astonishing. Well, it's true that you can create a lot of drama by giving everything away. It's absolutely true. And if Kerry could have given everything away in the Middle East negotiation he undertook, he would have. And he would have been a big success, I guess. But the fact is that it was an absurd negotiation. There was a lot of drama. We all got carried away by this negotiation of Mr. Kerry's 9 months, full peace. I think we're going to look back at this negotiation with Iran with the same amazed feeling that what an absurd idea that we could make a deal like this with the worst supporter of terrorism in the world, with a group that is on the verge of collapse, perhaps, for the first time, and give them the lifeline that this deal does for them. So I hope the deal works. Obviously, I'm an American. I'm a supporter of Israel. I'd like to see everything come out well. But I frankly believe that the right policy is the one we have with the Soviet Union. Pressure, diplomacy across the board, not limited just to nuclear. Human rights, everything. We need to care about all these things and show that we care. But we've opted for a different path.
One thing that we haven't raised here, and I'd like to hear Abbas Milani on this. You talked before about this is seeming like almost two different deals, depending on who was looking at it, and I certainly see it from the same perspective you do on that score. But how's it being viewed in Iran, particularly since the Revolutionary Guard and some of the more conservative elements in Iran look at this as making a deal with the great Satan? They don't necessarily, they want to stand firm against the United States and against the West. And so, to what extent is there resistance on that score?
Well, there is some resistance because they stand to lose financially. The IRGC made much of its money in counterband. It's estimated that from import of counterband, they make $22 billion a year alone. And they stand to lose that if Iran re-enters the international global market. But there is a remarkable near consensus from wide spectrum of forces inside Iran and in the diaspora. There are some opponents to it, like Mr. Alfoneh. The MEK is against it. There are many others who don't believe this regime should be trusted. But the greatest consensus that I have seen in the last 25 years in terms of the Iranian diaspora, from successful businessmen in the Silicon Valley to university academicians, to political prisoners inside Iran, to civil human rights activists, they have almost all come out in favor of this deal. And it isn't because they're deluded. It isn't because they don't understand the nature of this regime. They're looking for a respite. They're looking for a possibility that they might be able to push this thing a little further and get these brutal bastards off their high horses. And I think that is the key issue there. And to go again to something that Mr. Alfoneh says, first of all, they didn't pay $7 billion for that company. They virtually paid nothing for it. And they bought it for free. They bought it in the same privatization method, and it isn't something that's only in our country. Russia does it just as good as Iran does. Putin's cronies have made billions from that. They have learned that art from there. So IRGC literally bought that company for nothing. They literally forced every other bidder out of the market. Exactly. And now, now, as of yesterday, they're trying to put it on the market. They're trying to find an American or a European company to buy it.
Sure. Yeah.
Why? No, why? Because they see the writing on the wall. They see that if this deal works, if the market changes, then their monopoly position in virtually every aspect of the Iranian economy is going to end. To me, that is why there is a possibility. Again, you know, nobody knows who will win out of this argument. Nobody knows whether the IRGC, the radical wing of the IRGC, helped with Khamenei, will outmaneuver Rafsanjani and Rouhani and the 20 million, 18.5 million people who voted for it. My sense is that it is a less dangerous bet than the other alternative. And when Abe says the administration is giving away all of this, he assumes that the administration, again, is a unilateral actor in the international domain. No, the administration is working with Europeans who are fighting one another in terms of who goes to Iran first to make a deal. English foreign minister is in Tehran today. He might have left a few hours ago. And it clearly said, we are not going to follow the United States. We are on our own. We want to make deals. The French, who were most persistent in supposedly defending the rights of Israel to exist, were the first one to send their foreign minister to Iran to make a deal. European greed, Russian greed, Chinese greed, Indian greed allowed this regime to get its nuclear program to breakout capacity that they did when the Obama administration came on. That is essentially the nature of this deal, stopping them at this breakout capacity, prolonging how long it takes for them to break out, and wager, it is a wager that in this process, in this 15 years, a more rational, a more reasonable, a less brutal, a less barbaric regime will come to Iran. My sense, and this is my last point, my argument is very different than the neocon argument. The neocon argument was that you can export American democracy with American boots. That is nonsense. Democracy has to be indigenous. And where Iran is different than Iraq, when Iran is different than Syria, is that there is a powerful indigenous democratic force. No Arab Spring brought out 3 million people into the streets. Iran did in 2009. I was just reading today. There is a foundation controlled by the IRGC, the Foundation for the Dispossessed. They control bungee jumping in Tehran. And the only question is whether Iranian women are going to be allowed to bungee jump in Tehran. Right next door, you have Saudi Arabia, where a woman can't drive. Here, in the Islamic Republic of Iran, where they're supposed to wear the scarf, they're bungee jumping. That bungee jump is what I want to put my wager on.
I agree.
Your countryman was chomping at the bit there. Ali, what did you want to say?
Professor Milani and I, we share the genuine hope for Iran becoming a democracy. We do not disagree on that. The only point where I think there is some degree of disagreement is that Professor Milani believes that this nuclear agreement and influx of foreign cash, foreign currency into the Iranian economy automatically will lead to liberalization of Iran's economy and weakening of the Revolutionary Guards, particularly because there is bound to be competition and the monopolies of the Revolutionary Guards are going to be challenged by foreign companies present in Iran. My argument is that any foreign company entering Iranian business in the coming years because of the removal of the sanctions regime will end up cooperating with the Revolutionary Guards and will end up investing money in the companies of the Revolutionary Guards, which perpetuates Iran's economy as an economy controlled and dominated by the Revolutionary Guards. This, ladies and gentlemen, is not the path of democracy. This is the path of transformation of the Islamic Republic of Iran from a theocratic regime into a military dictatorship, which may or may not have a clerical leadership on top, but in reality, it is the Revolutionary Guard which is going to control the economy. This is the development that I foresee. In 1999, a Turkish company entered Iran. It was during the good years of the Khatami era. Khatami made a point of liberalizing Iran's economy. He really wanted to do these kind of things. So he actually allowed the Turkish company to start the business of offering mobile phone system to Iranians. And mobile phones are, popular in Iran. So the Turkish company, Turkcell, entered Iran. They opened an office. After 1 week, 10 members of the Revolutionary Guards, they show up with an axe. They cut the phone line of Turkcell's office in Tehran. So they could not even answer their own phone calls, let alone offering the Iranian public a mobile phone system service. They left Iran. There were lawsuits which still continue because of the interventions of the Revolutionary Guards. And the Revolutionary Guard did the same thing with several sectors of which are about to be privatized for Imam Khomeini International Airport. That was later in the 1990s. We are going to see a similar tendency in the coming years. And there is a reason why Mr. Khamenei cannot afford to alienate the Revolutionary Guards, because he needs their support. He needs their support next time there is another green revolution and people go to the streets of Tehran, 3 million people, because they are opposed to this type of theocracy. So this is why, ladies and gentlemen, opening of the Iranian economy, influx of foreign money into Iran does not necessarily mean transformation of Iran into democracy. It perpetuates this system as a military dictatorship.
David Holloway, and let's see how he sees things from what you just heard.
My co-panelists know a lot more about Iran than I do, but it strikes me that if the Iranian economy is as corrupt as you've portrayed it, it won't be that attractive to foreign investment. And it's not just the removal of, it's not just, of course there are people going there to explore what they can make in the new situation. But the part of the opening up, for example, opening up of the economy, begins to impose also certain disciplines on the Iranian economy. That's one point. The second point is, Abe has written about this very eloquently, and that is to say, look back at how we dealt with the Soviet Union in the 1980s. We pressed them on all fronts. Unfortunately, I think that dictators have also read what happened in the 1980s, and they don't see the outcome as being so great. So what they see is, oh my God, they're coming at us on all fronts, human rights, freedom of speech. No, we don't want that. That's the thing we most fear, actually. And I think Ali actually made that point earlier, that the Revolutionary Guards were afraid that what Rouhani might become a Gorbachev. Absolutely. So one of the issues, I think, that's, to my mind, it's not clear how it will work, but my sense is, for some people, opening up of Iran is absolutely what they want, to be part of the world. Other people absolutely don't want this because soft power, far preferable to nuclear weapons, soft power will begin to have an effect on the society and undermine the revolution. Revolutions go through phases. They reach a kind of middle age. Now, maybe the middle age will turn to military dictatorship, but at some level, I think, I'm encouraged to hear what Abbas says, that no, maybe this does give some chance for opening up. We're stopping, for a period at any rate, the nuclear program, or at least preventing it from going to nuclear weapons.
We do come back to the incontrovertible fact that this is a revolutionary Islamic regime that is dedicated and committed to, apparently, the annihilation and destruction of the State of Israel.
And the deterrent against any military action by Iran against Israel is, obviously, it's a primary element in Israeli defense policy, but it's also a key element in US policy. And that should not go. This, I think, in some ways, I think there are, some of the language supporting the deal has been far too optimistic and far too radical in saying, oh, well, you know, forever, Iran can never have nuclear weapons. And I think it's just not true.
I must say, though, that one of the most disturbing things to come out of this, and I'll say this publicly, has been what I perceive, and I'm not one to usually make the clarion calls on these kinds of things, but as a rise again of anti-Semitism. There are those who are in favor of this, especially when Chuck Schumer came out and gave his position. There were a lot of things that you could decode in terms of, oh, here's the, and it was coming from a lot of the Democrats. Here's all this money once again that's going to, as it did in the Iraq War. They're talking about neocons. They're talking really about wealthy Jewish people who are opposed to the Iranian agreement, and that in some ways rearing its ugly head again.
Yeah, and that's extremely regrettable. And at the same time, I think I can say that I think money has a corrosive effect on politics in this country. I think this is not one of the aspects you think.
Both the parties have been corrupted.
Yeah, no, I think it has a corrosive effect. And I think you would never, I don't say that thinking, oh, and anti-Semitism is one consequence of it. But I hope to goodness this is something very temporary around the passions that this particular deal has aroused. Because if that were to be a consequence, that would really be a terrible consequence.
Yeah, no, I hope you're right. We've got some of your questions here, and let's go to them. Abe, let me go to you on this first one. There's been discussion on secret parts of the deal where the U.S. will help defend the Iranians.
Apparently, there are a lot of, not only is the deal unprecedented in terms of what it is. You know, you don't know, it's not a treaty, it's not an executive agreement. The Iran Act is an amazing situation where you can get an agreement, an international agreement approved just because the president was able to get a third of the legislature to support him. It's a very incongruous situation. And the president has to go back to get money from Congress anyway. So it's a pretty futile endeavor. But the fact is that, you know, I think there is aspects of this that are unprecedented in terms of international agreements being presented to the Congress. The pieces of it are secret. Even the members of Congress on the committees are not being told everything. They're not being given the documents.
Are you apprised of this? I'm looking at the next card. I'm just going in seriatim here. What do you make of a part of the deal that obligates the U.S. to defend Iran against Israel's sabotage? Is anybody aware of that?
I know.
I mean,
The claim was
that,
made.
We did have that computer worm, you know, and Iran felt that Israel and the United States were involved in it. I don't know. There are parts of this agreement, frankly, that we don't know. Kerry says he hasn't even read the agreement. Before he fell off his bicycle, he said publicly that he hadn't read the agreement.
It's a very long agreement, but even the public parts are very long. I did want to say one thing about the sanctions. The administration keeps making the point, and you did too, that the Europeans are going to pull out anyway and our sanctions are going to be ineffective. It's not so. I mean, the sanctions in the JCPOA that are the U.S. sanctions are highly effective. These businesses in Europe that are going to want to invest in Iran are not going to be able to do business with the United States if those sanctions stay in place. And Kerry knows it. He's very upset about it because he's made a promise, and the president has as well, to the Europeans and the Chinese and the Russians, that they are going to be able to do this, and we're not going to interfere. So our banking system will not allow a bank that does business with Iran to bank with us. And we are very important in the world still. The fact is, you can't have it both ways. You can't be so upset that the JCPOA is not going to become U.S. law, and at the same time say it doesn't matter because these sanctions are meaningless. The fact is, the sanctions are very meaningful. They are not only meaningful as a practical matter, they're meaningful in principle because they send a message, we haven't finished with you, Iran. Even if we've made this deal, and we have about the nuclear stuff, we have your terrorism to deal with, we have your human rights to deal with, we have your interventions to deal with. Then there are still some bite to what we can do with Iran. And I think that we ought to keep that leverage.
David, you were going to say something here. Go ahead.
This is on on the previous point.
Yeah.
Well, I did read through the agreement, and there's nothing like that in the published agreement. Of course, who knows? I mean, there are the unknown.
There are other channels.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, there are other channels, but it would be actually, a curious commitment to make to Iran on this.
Well, another member of the audience wants to know, if no deal, what will the other signatories do? Now, Abe, you're saying the deal is done, but as I was asking Abbas before, you know, from the Iranian standpoint, maybe there's pushback. There's certainly pushback here in the United States. We may have another president within the next couple of years who's very opposed to this. I mean, things are in flux.
Even a president who repudiates the deal will not be able to reverse the UN resolution. That's adopted. And it terminates the 6 UN resolutions that we fought so hard for. And it does that if Iran complies. So Iran has a huge incentive to comply regardless of what we do. And so, I mean, I think people should understand the deal is done. We're just talking about whether we retain any capacity to pressure Iran to do all these other things. And we're supposed to be doing that. The president says that he intends to do that. Yeah. And so
Can I
think the JCPOA would help him do that.
Yeah, Abbas wants to weigh in here. Abbas.
You know, Abe, I fully agree with this idea that where they dropped the ball, and it isn't just this administration, other administrations have done the same.
Right.
The U.S. has dropped the ball on human rights. The nuclear issue should have never, in my view, and I have been writing this for 10, 15 years, yes. The nuclear issue should have never been negotiated and discussed absent the human rights issue. They should have done
completely.
Mike McFaul and I wrote with Larry Diamond, literally 14 years ago, that the U.S. should do with Iran what you, Secretary Shultz, and Reagan did with Soviet Union. Talk nuclear in the morning, talk human rights in the afternoon. And if you play only in the nuclear game, you're playing in their field. Because that's what they want to do. and they're good at cheating, and they're good at playing the legal system. The NPT allows them to become a virtual nuclear state, and then they can cheat the way North Korea did. They played this game beautifully, and I think every US administration that I know of fell into this trap of not talking about human rights. During the entire nuclear negotiations, not once did any Western power mention the fact that Iran's last presidential candidate, who had, according to this regime, in an election I thought was rigged, but he had 15 million votes. The guy has been under house arrest with his wife illegally with the other candidate for 5 years. Never once was their fate mentioned. That should have been front and center.
I completely agree with you. We've been pathetic. We've been pathetic on Iran, every administration. The same administration that I was honored to serve in, vis-a-vis the Soviet Union, the Reagan and first Bush administrations, did Iran-Contra. I mean, it was ridiculous.
Now let's go back to the fact that we really kept the Pahlavi throne in power, that we had everything to do in terms of our own CIA, and I don't want to sound like you're wild radical here, but the truth of the matter is, look at the history. It's a pretty ugly history in terms of U.S. support for forces against, well, what could have been an Iranian revolution, or what could have been certainly not the Iranian theocracy that we have today. I have a question for you, Ali, I think from someone in the audience. For those who oppose the deal, do you believe the former path, no deal, prevents Iran from creating a nuclear weapon in the next year or two?
So my approach would have been a better deal, a better approach of the US negotiators. Exactly because the Tehran regime was so desperate for cash at that time, the US government could have demanded more. Many times, the Iranian side did the Middle Eastern theatrics, from the bazaar, threatening to leave the negotiations and that kind of things. But of course, they were not willing to leave the negotiations because of the economic pressure all of them were under. So the U.S. could have demanded more. That was not the case, and unfortunately, the U.S. chose to believe the threats of the other party to leave the negotiations. This, I think, was a terribly, it was a missed opportunity to get a better agreement. It is not that I'm totally against any kind of agreement. I'm all for agreements, but it has to be a good agreement rather than the type of agreement which is not solving the nuclear issue, but is just postponing it.
Question I think Taylor made for Abe Sofair. You kind of alluded to it before a little bit. If the agreement is voted down by U.S. government, would Iran, excuse me, that's another question. What would Reagan have done, was this question I was going to ask.
Yeah, well, I wrote an op-ed piece several years ago, a Reagan approach to Iran, and Abbas and I have been agreed on this. I think we all agree on it, really, to keep the pressure on Iran across the board. So the administration, I think that Ronald Reagan, I hate to say this because people are uncomfortable with this idea, the idea of winning. Especially us Jews, where, there's a sort of sense of, when Ronald Reagan said, this is going to have an outcome, you're going to lose and we're going to win. And that's the way he talked, and that's the way he felt, and that's what he tried to do. And this regime in Iran is really a horrific regime. They are terrible people, and Abbas has written about them more extensively and more dramatically than anyone. They've thrown him out of the country. If he went back there, he'd be in prison. So Reagan would be at the table with them on every issue, just as he was with the Soviets. We would never have been dragging our feet. We should never have been dragging our feet in negotiating with Iran about everything, including human rights, of course. And we should be bugging them about everything and keeping the pressure on them about everything. So I think we've gone down the wrong road, but we still have the opportunity of retaining this authority to keep the pressure on them under the JCPOA, the U.S. sanctions. So that's what the argument's about. And people should understand that. The deal is done. The nuclear deal is not going to go away. Iran is not going to walk away. The issue is whether we give up all the sanctions, the U.S. sanctions listed in the JCPOA. And that's the issue. And unfortunately, it's not getting across.
I've got to ask Abbas, do you think Abe is overrating the power of U.S. sanctions?
I think he is overrating the power of unilateral U.S. sanctions.
That's what I'm talking about, yeah.
I think he is. What broke this regime's back was SWIFT and oil. This is a regime that understands power and understands power very well. If you hit it where it hurts, they will react. The sanctions, when they stopped the financial activity and when they stopped their ability to sell oil, that's when they came to the negotiating table. And those sanctions were effective only because the international community joined, and to Obama's credit, he got the Russians to join. Russia, that has been confronting the United States on virtually every issue, that has been trying to hit the United States on every issue. Russia that had been promising Ahmadinejad that they would veto sanctions. The game was somehow set up that they went along with the sanctions. And to me, that's what brought them to unilateral U.S. sanctions haven't worked. And
according to Ambassador McFall, I think we've said a lot of that had to do with Russia getting on board with Medvedev being in power rather than Putin.
But I also want to add just one bitter fact. In the last 2 years, when the sanctions have been at their hardest, when Iran's oil revenue was probably down to 35 to 40 billion, they gave 12 billion of it to the Syrian brutal regime. This is not a regime that walks away from its terrorist activity. This is a regime that in that same period that they had the lowest income, kept their money flow to Hamas, kept their money flow to Hezbollah, kept their money flow to the Shiites, to some of the insurgents in Afghanistan. So this is not a regime that, if you keep its finances limited, is responsible to its people. This is a very irresponsible regime. What I hope one day will come, and it might not work, is a regime that again responds to that call in the streets of Tehran. Neither Gaza nor Lebanon, long live Iran.
I'll go to another question here and follow up right on that, Abbas, if I may. Someone in the audience wants to know, when the embargo is lifted on long-range missiles in the 7 to 8 years, at what countries will they be aimed?
Well, the only, I mean, this is really something that's very clear. They now have missiles that can reach Israel. And so the only reason they need an ICBM is to reach Europe and the United States. And we had, among the 6 resolutions that are going to be terminated, we had repeated prohibitions on Iran from having missiles that can carry nuclear warheads. And those are going to go away now. And instead of that, all we will have is the words, we call upon Iran, in an appendix. We call upon Iran not to build ICBMs, and we insist that other states don't help them for 8 years. Now that's what's happened on ballistic missiles. That's it. That's the outcome. A prohibition has been converted into a request, please don't do this for 8 years, a prohibition on others helping them. That's what's happened with ballistic missiles, which the only purpose of which would be to attack Europe and the United States.
A couple more questions from you, our audience. A lot of people asking about oil and how this will affect things. Let me just bring a few of these together. What impact does collapsing oil prices have on this dynamic? And another member of the audience saying the ability to reimpose sanctions. I'm sorry. Okay. Some of you are asking questions about oil. What impact does collapsing oil prices have on this dynamic? And looking at another question that says the ability to reimpose sanctions, if Iran violates its commitments is a key provision. How would this work if, say, in 8 years, oil demand and prices shot up, it should read, no one will agree to reimpose sanctions? Ali?
So President Rouhani, in his entire campaign, he was making two arguments. He was saying that you Iranians are suffering financially and economically, you're jobless, you have all these privations because of two reasons. The incompetence of the Ahmadinejad government and because of the sanctions regime. Today, Iranian voters, wake up and they see that, Mr. Ahmadinejad is no longer in government, and sanctions regime are going to be removed. So they are going to ask questions to President Rouhani. So you promised that the economy would be better after a nuclear deal, and this is not happening. In February 2016, there is going to be election to the Iranian parliament, but also to a body called the Assembly of Experts, which, by the way, elects the next leader of revolution. So the person succeeding Mr. Khamenei in office as the leader of Iran is going to be elected by those people. And this is why the competition in Iran is so fierce. If the oil price is kept at a low level, and Mr. Rouhani cannot live up to his promises of improving the living standards of Iranians, I do not rule out that these two will actually somehow benefit the Revolutionary Guards and another populist type of politician who may emerge, from the midst of the Revolutionary Guards, questioning and attacking consistently the Rouhani team. Those people who are in Iran, and I agree, with Professor Milani that, the Iranian public actually supports the nuclear agreement. But the opponents, now that they have lost the nuclear discourse, they are saying they're attacking Rouhani because that he's incapable of delivering on his economic promises. And this is another, indication for me that, there are a lot of unknown factors on the Iranian side. And the people who may replace Mr. Rouhani in office as president, but also the parliamentary majority, are not going to be the same people who negotiated the solution, the agreement with the US. So the US may end up dealing with somebody who more or less resembles the Ahmadinejads of Iran and not, another Rouhani.
I think it's safe for me to say that each of our four distinguished guests has outlined his position quite well. I think before we ask Zach to come back up here and bring things to a close, maybe I could ask each of you in about a minute and a half to give an imparting message here in terms of what you stated as your position and what you would like people particularly to leave with. Abe, could I begin with you?
Sure. As I said, I think that we need to change the rhetoric on this issue from a general discussion of the deal, which I think is a done deal, and to the question of whether we want to retain any leverage over Iran through U.S. sanctions. I agree with Abbas that U.S. sanctions are not as good as multilateral sanctions, but they are something, and we need to keep the ball rolling. We need to keep the pressure on Iran, and this would be a good way to do it. Thank you.
Thank you. David.
Well, I would like people. I think the way to look at this deal is certainly an imperfect deal. And I agree with the general argument that in the past it was wrong to isolate the nuclear issue. But we're confronted with a particular situation we're in. It's not a matter of saying we should go back and do it differently. And there are some advantages from the deal. There's some great disadvantages too. But I think it does offer a chance for actually very stringent implementation, which will keep pressure on Iran and will not preclude applying pressure in the other areas. One aspect is that at some level it creates an engagement between the United States and Iran, which the US has avoided, and I think as a mistake to avoid. So I'm hoping that a more broad-based policy towards Iran and towards the Middle East is something that would be helped by this deal by removing, as I think, the immediate threat of Iranian nuclear weapons. That does not mean letting that either Israel or the United States or other powers should let their guards down. Absolutely not. Quite the opposite, because we don't know how the deal in the end will turn out in 10 or 15 years. But I think there's some kind of opportunity here that we should try to take advantage of.
Thank you, David. We'll hear finally from Abbas and Ali, but I have to say, I'm sorry for a few questions I didn't get to. One was, why do all the Israeli Jews oppose this deal and all the American Jews favor it? And that is not the case. You know, all the old jokes notwithstanding about the guy on the island who built 2 temples, and they said, why'd you build 2? He said, because I didn't want to worship at that one. Nevertheless, I think the American Jewish community is pretty divided on this. Just had to get that in. Ali, can we hear a final assessment from you? What you want people to really remember from your position?
In spite of me believing that this is a bad deal, my message is one of hope. The people of Iran and American people, but more interestingly, also the people of Israel, have historically had very, very good relations. 36 years after the revolution in Iran and establishment of the Islamic Republic, the Iranian Jewish community living inside of Iran has the size of 10,000 members. That is the largest Jewish community outside of Israel in the Middle East. That, I think, sends a very, very strong message of what the Iranian community is capable of. Iran is not an anti-Semitic country. Iranians are not anti-Semitic. And Iranians and Jews have been living a good life in Iran for centuries, yes, for thousands of years. So I do believe that a phenomenon like the Islamic Republic of Iran is a passing phenomenon, and the future is much brighter, in spite of the bad deal that we are unfortunately witnessing.
We'll hear finally from Abbas Milani. Abbas?
I think what I hope you can take away is that I've never seen the Middle East in as much of a crisis as today. There are 6 failed states and a couple of more failing states. And there is probably the greatest humanitarian crisis in the last 3 decades. There are 25,000 people who are going to die on the Mediterranean trying to get to Europe. You have ISIS on the rise, which is, in my view, the most frightening phenomena I have seen. If ISIS in Sinai gets the upper hand in Sinai Desert, and if ISIS becomes the dominant force in Syria, Israel is going to have a very serious problem. If you add to that the possibility of intifada, you are talking about a very troubled Middle East. In that troubled Middle East, this deal is the least bad deal possible. It gives us a respite. It gives people. There is a risk. Absolutely, I understand. Some of this money will go to the wrong places. But if history is any indication, when these kinds of openings happen, then good things emerge. And the advocates of hatred are moved away. Not only Iranians are not anti-Semitic, Iran is a country that saved every one of its Jews from the Holocaust. Not only Iran saved every one of its Jews, Iran saved thousands of Jews by selling them passports or giving them passports. Ahmadinejad is an abomination of Iranian history and humanity. He is not Iran.
Let me just say before I turn things over to Zach, I think this has been really an illuminating evening. Would you all agree to put it on? This is a troubling issue and will remain one, certainly, but I thank all of you for your attention and your concern. And please, a round of applause for our 4 distinguished guests.
And if you will, another round of applause for our moderator, too, Michael Krasny.
Yeah.
to thank them for coming tonight, for spending a late evening with us. I want to thank you for being out here tonight. And I want to thank the ICC for putting this on. It's a tremendous department here at the JCC. In particular, under the leadership of Ronit Jacobs, Roni Antebi, Netta, Hagit, all of your team. Ronit, you do a wonderful job. Thank you. And the last thing I'll say before you head out, we did live stream this because it was such a packed crowd. There were folks in another room here at the JCC, so we were recording this as well, and you'll be able to find it up on our website in a couple days, okay? Thank you for coming tonight.